a weird one, but what's the funniest or most embarrassing moment, if any, that you've experienced during a political debate or public appearance?
Thankfully, I don't think I've had a super embarrassing one yet. I hesitate to say that because maybe I might have one. I'm trying to think. There's nothing stand out for me in terms of funny moments. I mean, there are some parliamentarians who can be quite amusing in how they say things and their style and the way they position things. Yeah, I mean, there have been times in the past when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. I mean, I can't stand the man, and he did all sorts of things that I strongly disagree with, but he can be quite amusing in his rhetoric and the way he speaks. And similarly with Michael Gove, again, I strongly disagree with him, but he can be quite entertaining at the dispatch box. So, but I can't think of a standout funny moment.
Okay.
It's been quite a challenging parliament, you know. We've had to deal with COVID, war in Ukraine, the Gaza issue, you know, the death of the Queen.
A lot of quite serious.
In some ways, it's been a very, is heavy and challenging parliament, but equally absurd because we've had 3 prime ministers.
Slightly away from politics, I've got my first GCSE coming up, which is Spanish speaking. And I know that you're something of a linguistics expert, aren't you? You studied French and German at Cambridge. So
I did.
Why specifically did you choose to study languages? And do you have any top tips for language students like myself that are struggling a little?
So, why did I study languages? I loved learning languages. It was something I felt I had, at the time, a natural aptitude for. I can barely speak either language anymore. But certainly at school, I sort of thrived and excelled in languages. So, I enjoyed it. I found it was probably one of the subjects I found easiest compared to, say, science and maths that I always really struggled with.
Chemistry and physics are hard, yeah. Science is difficult.
Yeah, and I love learning about other cultures and other countries as well. It's one of the reasons I always have been and always will be a massive pro-European. You know, I love France in particular because that was the language I majored on. I love spending time in France and you know, learning about the culture and the cuisine and the people and so on. So yeah, that's why I studied languages. I enjoyed it and I enjoyed them and excelled at them. Top tips. I think my top tip would be to try and enjoy it. I know that's hard, but sort of seeing it as a massive slog. The best way, and one of actually another top tip, and this was in the days when it was much harder to listen to foreign radio because we didn't have digital. I'm showing my age again. I'm going to be 46 this month. So I think my GCSEs were 30 years ago, and in those days we didn't have digital radio. So I would be sort of twiddling around with the knobs on my cassette radio in my bedroom on long wave, trying to listen to France Inter, or I can't remember what the other French radio station was. But my top tip actually to try and improve your language skills is trying to listen to if you're learning Spanish radio. It really helps with your listening skills, your vocabulary, or indeed if you can find TV channels now, if you've got the relevant TV packages to be able to access Spanish TV stations, because that way you can actually sort of sometimes listen to things or watch things that might be enjoyable, but at the same time improve your listening skills and your vocabulary.
Our main audience is young women, so that will include language students. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people taking that on board. Speaking of that, as this is the podcast Women in Westminster, what advice would you give to another woman considering a career in politics?
Don't let anyone or anything hold you back. There will be people who say, oh, it's too difficult, or you get too much flack, or you're not cut out for it. You know, if you're passionate about issues, if you're passionate about making a change, if you're passionate about representing your community and standing up for your community and making your area a better place, as well as the country a better place, then put yourself forward. And of course it's hard. You know, it took my journey between realising that I probably wanted to quite seriously look into how to become an MP and actually getting elected took me about 16 years.
Oh, wow. I haven't been alive for 16 years.
Yeah. And
wow.
Almost to the day, to 16 years. And so, you know, it's not easy. It requires a lot of hard work and a lot of sacrifices. But if you're passionate, if you're driven, and with the right support, help and advice, you can do it. And yeah, I know there's a lot out there, particularly around female politicians, around the abuse and the trolling, and how difficult it is, and the threats. And sadly, for some of my colleagues, that is very true. I feel very fortunate and blessed that I've personally not experienced much of that at all, either as a woman or as a brown person in politics. So yes, while it is prevalent for a lot, it is not universally the case that if you're a woman or in an ethnic minority in politics that you're going to necessarily suffer abuse. That's not to say that at some point I won't, particularly if I'm very vocal on a controversial issue that is part of a polarised debate. I think that's when you're particularly likely, sadly, to come in for more criticism and abuse. But don't let that put you off, because if we let people who threaten our safety and abuse us put off good people going into politics, then they've won, and our politics will be the poorer and the worse for it.
Yes, the abuse towards MPs is terrible. You know, I have so much respect for everyone that goes into politics for good and genuine reasons, knowing full well that they could experience intimidating behaviour. I actually spoke to Kim Ledbeater last episode. We spoke about her sister briefly. That was absolutely terrible. But I think that a lot of people forget that politicians are human too. And like you said, if you let them know that they're able to intimidate you, then they've won. And politics becomes much worse as a result of that. So, you know, good on you and good on all the MPs in politics for genuine reasons, for not letting those threats get to them. But if you could enact one quirky law that reflects your personality or values, what would it be and why?
A quirky law? What do you mean by that?
Sort of like innovative, that hasn't really been discussed that much before.
Well, I don't think it's quirky, but I think it reflects my passion and my desire to engage more children and young people in our politics and in policy making. It's not very quirky because various people have talked about it and tried to introduce legislation before, but I'd love to reduce the voting age to 16.
Yeah, I'd really like that. I mean, I know that's been spoken about before, but I do believe that is something quirky, because it's a fairly new kind of thing to talk about. You know, I didn't really hear that much about it until sort of a couple of years ago, and it doesn't really feel like it's getting anywhere when it really should be.
We need a new push on that.
100%. Thank you so much for your time, Munira. It was lovely to speak with you. Listeners, join me next week on Women in Westminster, when I'll be speaking to Ruth Cadbury.